February 1945. The Gothic Line, northern Italy. 24 Allied divisions are locked in a brutal stalemate against the German Wehrmacht in the Apennine Mountains. Among them, a force that nobody expected to see on European soil. Brazilian soldiers, 5,000 miles from home, wearing the patch of a smoking snake coiled around the letters FIB, Força Expedicionária Brasileira. They've been told the mission is impossible. Monte Castelo, a fortress carved into the mountain itself, has already repelled 4 separate Allied assaults. American battalions tried. They failed. Then regiments. They failed too. The casualties mounted, the winter came, and the mountain remained German. But now, as spring breaks over the Apennines, it's Brazil's turn. What happens next will defy every expectation. Because in the final days of April, near a town called Fornovo di Taro, a Brazilian reconnaissance unit will corner an entire German division. 14,800 enemy soldiers, and through a combination of audacity, deception, and one utterly unthinkable tactical choice, the Brazilians will force them to surrender without firing a shot. This is the story of how a nation with no modern combat experience, whose last war ended in 1870, sent farmers and shopkeepers into the most savage theater of World War II. How they learned to fight in the frozen hell of the Apennines, how they earned the respect of veterans who'd been bleeding since North Africa, and how in their finest hour they gave the Wehrmacht no choice but to drop their weapons and raise their hands. They gave up instantly. Brazil, 1939. While Europe descended into war, a nation of 40 million people faced a crisis of identity. In the streets of Rio de Janeiro, fascist sympathizers marched under the green banner of the Integralistas. In the union halls of São Paulo, communist organizers recruited in whispers. The country stood at a crossroads, pulled between ideologies, uncertain of its future. The military reflected this division. Senior officers who had studied German doctrine admired the precision of the Wehrmacht. They watched newsreels of panzers rolling through Poland and believed, with grim certainty, that Germany would win. Why oppose a force that seemed unstoppable? But others saw something different. They saw democracies under siege. They saw the darkness behind the propaganda. Then, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet burns, and suddenly, the Western Hemisphere is at war. President Roosevelt, who had been carefully building a Pan-American alliance, now calls in every favor, every diplomatic promise. Brazil, with its vast Atlantic coastline, its strategic northeastern bulge pointing toward Africa, becomes the linchpin of the South Atlantic. By early 1942, German U-boats are hunting in Brazilian waters. They sink merchant ships within sight of the coast. Torpedoes tear through hulls carrying coffee, rubber, families. The attacks kill Brazilian civilians. The outrage is immediate and total. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Osvaldo Aranha, seizes the moment. Against internal opposition, against the pro-German faction in government itself, he pushes Brazil toward war. August 1942. Brazil declares war on the Axis. But declaring war and fighting one are different things. The Brazilian army numbers in the tens of thousands, but they are equipped with obsolete weapons, organized along outdated French doctrine from World War I. Their last real conflict was the Paraguayan War, 73 years in the past. Nobody, not even the Brazilians themselves, knows if they can fight a modern war. The decision is made. Brazil will send an expeditionary force to Europe, not a token unit, a full division. 3 regiments of infantry, artillery battalions, support elements, 25,000 men. The 1st Brazilian Expeditionary Infantry Division, the FEB. Volunteers flood the recruitment stations. Students, factory workers, cowboys from the interior who've never seen the ocean. They come because their country called, because their pride demanded it, because ships flying the Brazilian flag had been sunk. But most of all, they come because of something deeper, a sense of duty that transcends education or wealth. These men may be poor, many illiterate, but they possess something the elite shouting for war in the streets do not: the willingness to actually go. The Americans provide the equipment: M1 Garand rifles, Browning machine guns, jeeps and trucks. The Brazilians train frantically, trying to compress years of modern warfare doctrine into months. They drill with unfamiliar weapons. They learn to operate radios, coordinate with artillery, move as motorized units instead of horse-drawn columns. And then in July 1944, the first ships leave Rio de Janeiro. Destination, Naples. Theatre, Italy. Mission, join the Fifth Army in the push toward the Gothic Line, and beyond it, the Po Valley. The voyage takes 15 days through submarine-infested waters. The men sleep in bunks, stacked 4 high, wearing life jackets around the clock, knowing that if a torpedo strikes, their chances of survival are measured in seconds. When they finally disembark at Naples in August, they step into a world transformed by total war. The city is shattered, harbours choked with sunken ships, buildings reduced to hollow shells, and everywhere, the machinery of the American war effort. Supply depots stretching for miles, truck convoys moving day and night, the organized chaos of an army that has rebuilt an entire continent's infrastructure while fighting across it. The Brazilians are given a sector in the Serchio Valley, a quiet area, secondary front. The Americans want to see what this untested force can do before committing them to the main effort. It's a test. The Brazilians know it. And they pass. September 15th, 1944. The FEB enters combat for the first time. The German positions are dug into hillsides, camouflaged, defended by veterans of 3 years of Italian campaigning. The Americans have been stalled here for weeks. The Brazilians attack. They advance 40 kilometers in 6 weeks. It's not pretty. It's not perfect. Soldiers freeze under fire during their first artillery barrage. Officers make mistakes that cost lives. But they learn. They adapt. And crucially, they keep moving forward. The American commanders take notice. The Fifth Army, desperately short of infantry after divisions were pulled for the invasion of southern France, suddenly has a unit that shows aggression, initiative, and an unwillingness to stay pinned down. But then comes the counterattack. Castelnuovo di Garfagnana. The Germans, stung by the Brazilian advance, strike back hard. The FEB, still learning, still adjusting, is forced to retreat. Men who had been celebrating their success days earlier now scramble backward through mountain passes, dragging their wounded, abandoning positions they'd bled to take. For some commanders, this would be the end. Proof that the Brazilians weren't ready. But General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, sees something else. He sees a unit that advanced when others stalled, a unit that, despite the setback, maintained cohesion and discipline during withdrawal. He makes a decision that will define the rest of the campaign. The FEB is transferred to the Reno Valley, the main front, the spine of the Gothic Line. They've been, as Clark himself puts it, promoted to the first team. November 1944. The Brazilians arrive in the Apennines and immediately understand why the advance has stopped. These aren't hills. They're mountains, steep and unforgiving, with German positions on every ridge. Supply lines snake up narrow roads that enemy artillery can interdict at will. Movement in daylight draws immediate fire. The weather turns. Rain gives way to snow. Temperatures plummet below zero. And dominating everything, visible for miles, is Monte Castelo. It's not the tallest peak, it's not the most dramatic, but it's positioned like a watchtower over Highway 64, the main route to Bologna. From its summit, German observers can call artillery strikes on anything that moves. The road is unusable. The offensive is dead until Monte Castelo falls. The Americans have already tried to take it. Twice. Both times battalions went up and came back shattered. Then they sent in regiments, full-strength, experienced units. The result was the same. The mountain is a fortress, interconnected bunkers, machine gun nests sited to create overlapping fields of fire, mortar pits pre-registered on every approach, minefields, wire. Hand behind all of it, soldiers of the German 232nd Infantry Division, men who have been fighting since before Stalingrad, who know exactly how to break an attack. The winter deepens. The offensive is suspended. The front lines freeze into position, separated by a few hundred meters of snow-covered no-man's land. The war becomes a matter of patrols, small raids, survival. The Brazilians learn to operate in conditions they'd never imagined. They learn about frostbite, about trench foot, about how metal becomes so cold it burns skin on contact, But worse than the cold is the psychological pressure. In Brazil's interior, where many of these men come from, the concept of snow is abstract. Now they're living in it, fighting in it, watching it bury their dead. Some break. Neuroses, combat fatigue. Men who simply cannot function anymore. The field hospitals treat frostbite and gunshot wounds and shattered minds. Yet most endure. They write letters home that their families will read months later. They share cigarettes and stories in frozen dugouts. They maintain their weapons in conditions that would make such maintenance seem impossible. And they wait for spring. Because everyone knows that when the snow melts, the order will come. The mountain will have to be taken. And the FEB will be part of that assault. February 1945. The final winter storms pass. The Fifth Army begins planning the spring offensive, the push that will, if successful, break through the Gothic Line, descend into the Po Valley, and end the war in Italy. But first, the door must be opened. And Monte Castelo is the lock. This time the plan is different. No more battalion-sized attacks. No more piecemeal commitments. 2 full divisions. The American 10th Mountain Division, veterans of winter warfare specially trained for exactly this kind of terrain, and the 1st Brazilian Infantry Division. The 10th Mountain will strike at Mazancana, a neighboring peak. The FEB will take Monte Castelo itself. The Brazilian soldiers prepare in silence. They've seen what this mountain does to attackers. Some of them were part of the earlier failed attempts, attached to American units, and they know the routes up are killing grounds. But orders are orders. And there's something else now, something that wasn't there in the fall. Experience. They've spent months in combat. They've learned how to fight in mountains, how to navigate under fire, how to stay alive when everything is trying to kill them. February 21st, dawn. The artillery barrage begins. American guns, positioned miles behind the lines, pour shells onto the German positions. The mountain disappears in smoke and flame. It's a preparation bombardment unlike anything the Brazilians have witnessed before. Systematic, overwhelming, designed not just to kill but to shatter morale, to make the defenders believe that nothing could survive such fury. The barrage lifts, the assault begins. Brazilian infantry, organized into company columns, start up the slopes. The snow is deep. The gradient is severe. They're climbing toward an enemy who has had months to prepare, who knows every fold of ground, every position where attackers must cluster. The German artillery responds. Shells burst in the trees, sending shrapnel and splinters ripping through the ranks. Men fall. The columns compress, reorganize, keep moving. Halfway up, they hit the minefields. Explosions erupt without warning. Soldiers step on buried charges and disappear in blasts of frozen earth. The engineers move forward, probing with bayonets, marking safe paths. The infantry follows single file through corridors only meters wide, knowing that one step off the marked route means death. The German machine guns open up. Interlocking fields of fire, exactly as expected. The lead elements go to ground, pinned, unable to advance or retreat. This is the moment where the earlier attacks failed, when momentum died, when casualties mounted, when the assault disintegrated into chaos. But the Brazilian officers, many of them now veterans of 6 months of continuous combat, make the crucial decisions. They don't order frontal charges into the machine guns. They identify dead ground, small folds in the terrain that offer cover. They move by infiltration, small groups darting forward while others provide covering fire. And then something remarkable happens. A young lieutenant, a man from Mato Grosso, cattle country, who joined the FEB as a volunteer, identifies a ravine, a streambed cutting up the mountainside, too steep for the Germans to have fortified effectively. It's a gamble. The ravine is exposed at points, but it offers a route to the summit that bypasses the main defensive positions. He takes his platoon in, 60 men moving fast, climbing hard. The Germans don't see them until too late. The Brazilians emerge near the peak, behind the primary defenses. They assault directly into the command post. Machine guns fire. Grenades detonate in confined spaces. The fighting is intimate and vicious. And then the lieutenant reaches the church tower at the summit and opens fire with a captured machine gun, raking the German positions from above. The defense collapses. German soldiers, seeing enemies behind them, believing they're surrounded, abandon their positions. Some surrender. Others flee down the reverse slope. By nightfall, the Brazilian flag flies over Monte Castelo. When they secure the summit, the Brazilians find bodies. Brazilian bodies. Soldiers from the first assault back in November, who had actually reached the top but lacked the strength to hold it. They died up here, alone, in the snow. Now their comrades bury them and hold the ground they'd given everything to take. The cost has been high, but the door is open. Highway 64 is no longer under direct observation. The offensive can continue. And the FEB, bloodied but unbroken, has proven something that matters more than tactics or training. That they can take an objective that defeated everyone else who tried. General Krittenberger, commanding the IV Corps, visits the Brazilian command post. He's seen the mountain. He knows what it cost the Americans. He tells the Brazilian commanders simply and directly, "You did what we couldn't." April 1945. The Gothic Line is breaking. The spring offensive, launched in mid-April, smashes through German positions across the entire front. The Brazilians, reinforced and resupplied, attack the town of Montese, another fortified position, another desperate defense. They take it in a coordinated assault that Krittenberger later holds up as a textbook example of how to capture a fortified town. The American staff officers are told to study what the Brazilians did, to learn from it. But even as Montese falls, even as the defensive line fractures, the Germans maintain discipline. They're retreating, but it's a fighting withdrawal, orderly, controlled. They're falling back toward the Po Valley, toward prepared positions where they plan to make another stand. The Allied command knows that if the Germans reach those positions and consolidate, the war could drag on for months more. The race is on. Reach the Po Valley before the Germans can organize. Cut them off. Destroy them in the open. April 26th. The Brazilian division descends from the mountains and enters the vast flatlands of the Po Valley. For months they've fought in vertical terrain, in snow, in forests. Now they're in farmland, open, flat, with long sight lines and room to maneuver. But the infantry is moving too slowly. They're on foot, carrying everything they need, and the Germans are in vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, pulling away. The Brazilian commander makes a decision. He orders the artillery to hand over their trucks to the infantry. It's unprecedented. Artillery units depend on their vehicles for mobility, for positioning the guns. But the commander sees the opportunity and knows it won't last. The gunners, incredulous but obedient, turn over their transport. Infantry companies pile into trucks designed to haul ammunition and climb in, 60 men to a vehicle meant for cargo. The reconnaissance squadron, the cavalry unit, equipped with armored cars and jeeps, races ahead. Their mission: find the enemy, fix them, hold them until the infantry arrives. April 28th. Near the town of Fornovo di Taro, the reconnaissance unit makes contact. It's not a patrol, it's not a rearguard. It's an entire German division, thousands of soldiers, complete with artillery, supply columns, headquarters staff. They're retreating west, trying to reach the Alps, trying to escape into Austria before the net closes. The squadron commander, a cavalry officer who has led from the front since September, immediately grasps the situation. He has perhaps 200 men. The Germans have 14,800. If he attacks directly, he'll be annihilated. If he waits for reinforcements, the Germans will slip away. He needs to do something else. He surrounds the town. Or rather, he creates the appearance of surrounding the town. His armored cars and jeeps race around the perimeter, firing from multiple positions, moving constantly, making noise. Small units set up roadblocks on the escape routes. Patrols probe the German positions, not to attack but to be seen. The message is clear: you're trapped. There are forces everywhere. Resistance is futile. Inside Fornovo, the German commander, General Otto Fretter-Pico, a veteran of the Eastern Front, an officer who has commanded divisions since 1942, assesses the situation. His troops are exhausted. They've been retreating for days. Morale is shattered. The war is clearly lost. Everyone knows that Berlin is encircled, that Hitler's Reich is in its death throes, and now Brazilian forces of all things, have him pinned. He could fight. His division still has combat power. They have artillery, machine guns, small arms. A breakout attempt might succeed, but it would cost lives. German lives for a cause that no longer exists. And for what? To retreat another 50 kilometers before being trapped again. Fretter-Pico sends an emissary under a white flag. The squadron commander receives him and directs him to the regimental commander, who is racing forward with the infantry. The message is simple. The German general wishes to discuss terms. The Brazilian regimental commander is blunt. There are no terms. Unconditional surrender or nothing. Hours pass. The Germans stall. They're trying to determine if this is real, if the Brazilians actually have the force to back up their position. Scouts probe the Brazilian lines and report back. There are troops everywhere, blocking every route. What they don't realize is that those troops everywhere are the same units, moving constantly, creating the illusion of overwhelming strength. April 29th. Fretter-Pico makes his decision. He will surrender. The entire division, all personnel, all equipment, all weapons. They gave up instantly. The surrender ceremony is carefully choreographed. German soldiers march to designated collection points and stack their rifles. Machine guns are disassembled and piled. Artillery pieces are abandoned in place. Officers remove their sidearms and hand them over. The German soldiers form up one last time, by battalion, by company, and their commanders give final orders before separating. Officers to one camp, NCOs to another, enlisted men to a third. 14,800 prisoners, tanks, artillery, thousands of rifles and machine guns, supply depots, everything. Captured by a reconnaissance squadron and an infantry regiment that numbered barely 3,000 men. The largest single surrender of German forces to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. The capstone of their campaign. When Marshal Mascarenhas de Moraes, the division commander, learns of the surrender, he calls it the most spectacular operation of the entire war. Not Monte Castelo with its blood and sacrifice, not Montese with its textbook execution, but this, the moment when a cornered enemy looked at a Brazilian force and chose surrender over battle. May 2nd, 1945. All German forces in Italy surrender unconditionally. The war in the Mediterranean theatre is over. The FEB is assigned an occupation zone centered on the city of Alessandria in Piedmont. They're supposed to stay for months, perhaps years, as part of the occupation force. But Brazil says no. The government wants its soldiers home. By July, they're boarding ships in Genoa. By August, they're sailing into Rio de Janeiro harbor. The reception is overwhelming. The entire city has turned out. Confetti rains from buildings, bands play, people weep and cheer. These men, farmers, shopkeepers, workers, are heroes. But the celebration is brief. The veterans scatter to their home states, to their towns and villages. There are local parades, local honors. And then reality reasserts itself. The jobs they left are gone. The fiancés they wrote to have moved on. The country they fought for doesn't have a veterans program, doesn't have benefits, doesn't have counseling for men who've seen things that civilians cannot comprehend. Many struggle. Some never adjust. The readjustation is brutal, made worse by the fact that most Brazilians, while grateful, don't really understand what happened in Italy. The newspapers covered the broad strokes, but the details, the cold, the fear, the friends buried on foreign hillsides, those don't translate. Within the army itself, the reception is complicated. Most officers didn't go to Italy. The force that stayed behind is larger, and in some ways, resentful. There's resistance to giving special treatment to FEB veterans, no premium pay, no guaranteed promotions. The expeditionary units are quickly disbanded. The army wants to move on, wants to forget the irregularity of having sent a division to fight in someone else's war. But some things cannot be forgotten. The tactical lessons learned in Italy reshape Brazilian military doctrine. Officers who commanded in combat become instructors, bringing real experience to training schools. The organizational structures proven effective in the mountains. The integration with American logistics, the emphasis on initiative, the combined arms coordination becomes standard. And there are the numbers, the raw, undeniable numbers. The FEB spent 239 days in combat without rotation. No other Allied division in Italy fought that long without relief. They suffered 465 killed in action, 1,577 wounded, 29 missing. They captured 20,573 enemy soldiers, including 2 generals. They held sectors of the line that freed American and British divisions for offensive operations. They took objectives that others had failed to take. The smoking snake patch, adopted because of the Brazilian saying it's easier for a snake to smoke than for Brazil to go to war, became a symbol of defiance, of doing the impossible. The joke became prophecy. The snake smoked, and Brazil went to war. Historians would later debate the strategic significance. Was the Italian campaign necessary? Could those resources have been better used elsewhere? But for the men who were there, the questions are irrelevant. They were given a mission. They accomplished it. And in the final accounting, when the full weight of evidence is examined, one fact stands unchallenged. When measured against other Allied divisions in the Italian theatre, when comparing days in combat, casualties inflicted, prisoners captured, objectives secured, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force performed as well as any unit and better than most. They proved that national inexperience, limited resources, and a truncated training cycle could be overcome by leadership, adaptability, and the simple refusal to quit. 75 years later, in a military cemetery in Rio de Janeiro, the monuments stand in neat rows. Marble and bronze, names etched in stone, the men who never came home and the men who came home broken. The final tally of a small nation's gamble on the world stage. The veterans who survived into old age would tell a different story than the one in history books. They'd talk about the cold, always the cold, about friends who died badly, about fear that never quite goes away. But they'd also talk about something else, about proving themselves, about standing beside Americans and Brits and Poles and knowing they belonged, about showing the world that Brazil, whatever its problems, whatever its poverty, could produce soldiers who would not break. The German General Fretter-Pico survived the war and returned to Germany. He never explained in detail why he surrendered to such a small force. Perhaps it was pragmatism, perhaps exhaustion, or perhaps in that moment outside Fornovo, surrounded by troops he'd underestimated, he simply recognized that fighting on would accomplish nothing but needless death. The reconnaissance commander, the man who bluffed an entire division into surrender, returned to Brazil and continued his military career. He never spoke publicly about the specifics of that day, maintaining the professional silence common to soldiers of his generation. But those who served with him knew what he'd done, how he'd read the situation perfectly, how he'd gambled everything on psychological warfare and won. And Monte Castelo, the mountain that became a symbol, still stands in the Apennines. Hikers walk the trails where men once bled. The bunkers have collapsed. The trenches have eroded. But occasionally, even now, farmers ploughing fields will unearth a rusted helmet, a corroded rifle, a fragment of shrapnel. Physical reminders that this ground was once contested at the cost of human lives. The story of the FEB is not widely known outside Brazil. In the grand narrative of World War II, they're a footnote. But footnotes matter, because in that war, in that place, a nation that had every excuse to fail instead succeeded. They sent men who had never seen combat to fight veterans of 3 years of war. They asked farmers to climb frozen mountains under artillery fire. They ordered cavalry to bluff an enemy force 7 times their size. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. The snake smoked. Brazil went to war. And when it mattered most in the spring of 1945, 14,800 German soldiers looked at a Brazilian force and made a choice. They dropped their weapons, raised their hands, and surrendered. Not because they were defeated on the battlefield, but because the Brazilians convinced them that further resistance was pointless. That's not just military history, that's the art of war at its finest. Victory without bloodshed, surrender without siege, the unthinkable trick that ended not with fire and destruction, but with silence and raised hands. They gave up instantly. And in doing so, they wrote the final chapter of one of the most unlikely military success stories of the Second World War.